Welcome everyone to this second event in OHE's three-part series on informal caring burden in HTA, commissioned and funded by Roche. In our first session, we heard about the burdens of informal caring and why HTA should take these into account when assessing the value of new health technologies. In this second event, I'm delighted to say that we'll be hearing from Becky Pennington about the carer burden in health technology assessment, the current state of play. Becky is a senior research fellow at the University of Sheffield. She has an NIHR doctoral research fellowship to study carer health-related quality of life and its inclusion in economic evaluations, and is the lead author of two key papers on this subject. After Becky, David Mott will discuss issues in the modeling of carer quality of life. David is a senior principal economist at OHE. He is an expert in measuring and valuing health outcomes to inform economic evaluation, and he has specific expertise in the use of patient-reported outcome measures and stated preference methods. He is a member of the Euroqual Group Association and has published widely in peer-reviewed journals. While Becky and David are speaking, please enter any questions you might have in the Q&A section to the right-hand side of the screen that you should be seeing right now. We will try to address as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A session following the formal presentations. Now, please let me pass over to Becky.
Hi, I'm Becky Pennington. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the University of Sheffield, and I'm going to talk about how carer burden is currently captured in health technology assessment. In my presentation, we'll look at global guidance for including carer burden in health technology assessment. We'll focus in on guidance from the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence in England and how they've included carer burden. We'll look at the evidence that's been used for including carer burden and the methods that have been used to do that, and finally look at the impact of including carer burden on cost effectiveness results in health technology assessment. The work that I'm presenting today is based on a couple of key publications and my ongoing National Institute for Health Research Fellowship. In 2020, I published a review of NICE appraisals that I undertook as part of NICE's Decision Support Unit, and that piece of research was funded by NICE. In 2022, I published a review of global HTA guidance with case studies and recommendations, and that research was funded by Takeda Limited. This webinar is obviously sponsored by Roche, but I'd like to note that all of the views expressed in this presentation are my own, and they don't represent the views of any of those funders, nor of my employer, the University of Sheffield. We've called this section Global HTA Guidance, but it comes with the disclaimer that this is by no means a comprehensive review of HTA guidance from all over the world. Instead, we focus on a few key HTA bodies that we're aware of, where they give guidance in English and where we're aware of the role that economic evaluation plays. All of the HTA bodies have different roles and different remits regarding how their advice is used within their respective countries and in terms of the role that economic evaluation plays. We're particularly interested in those economic evaluations that use cost utility analysis. So really, we're thinking about whether carer quality adjusted life years are included in addition to the standard patient quality adjusted life years, or QALYs. So some HTA bodies specify that carers should be included in the reference case, although sometimes noting that this should be where relevant. And that includes NICE, who we'll look at in more detail on future slides, and guidance for France. Other HTA bodies refer to including all individuals in the reference case, although they might not specifically mention carers. This includes the Zorg Institute in the Netherlands, who say that all societal costs and benefits, regardless of who the cost comes from or who the benefits go to, should be taken into account. And the Health Information and Quality Authority in Ireland, who refer to all individuals. Other guidance suggests that carers should be included, but only in scenario analyses. This includes the Canadian Agency for Drugs and Technologies in Health, who say that they should consider potential spillovers in a non-reference case analysis. And there's similar guidance from ISA in the United States, from IQVIG in Germany, and the Norwegian Institute for Public Health, who say that results should be presented with and without carers. There are some HTA bodies who are explicit that they want carers to be excluded from the reference case. PBAC in Australia prefer to only see health-related outcomes associated with the patient, and Pharmac in New Zealand have similar guidance. On other occasions, we've found that the guidance from HTA bodies can be quite unclear. The TLB in Sweden describes a societal perspective with all costs and effects outside the healthcare sector, but we're not entirely clear whether this means carers or other people as well, or neither. The Scottish Medicines Consortium appears to have conflicting advice within its documentation. It sometimes seems like carers should be included, but then other times it seems to say that this is outside of their perspective. And then there are some HTA bodies who don't mention carers, so we're really not clear, such as the All Wales Medicine Strategy Group and the Italian HTA agency. In NICE's most recent guidance, their 2022 Manual for Health Technology Evaluations, they state that the perspective on outcomes should be all health effects, whether for patients or when relevant carers. They do expand on this slightly to say sometimes this could be other people, but this is mainly carers. Where evaluations are including health effects for carers, NICE state that they would like to see evidence both to say that the condition itself is associated with a carer burden in terms of health-related quality of life, and also evidence of how the technology itself affects carers. So that's the official guidance from NICE, that carers can be included, but how common is it? Well, in 2019, I reviewed all published technology appraisals to see whether they had included carers, and I didn't find many that did. It's around 3%. My review has since been updated, and other researchers have looked at published appraisals since, and they found a similar small number. In this case, because there's fewer appraisals overall within that time period, the proportion has increased slightly from 3% to around 6%. So we can see it's not very common. Where carers are included more commonly is in NICE's highly specialised technology programme. And this programme considers very rare or orphan diseases with very small patient numbers, few treatment options, and challenges in the research or the evidence due to the uniqueness of the disease. In 2019, I found that 4 of 8 published appraisals had included carer burden in quality adjusted life years, and the update to that review found 7 of 9 published within the time period between 2019 and 2022 included carers. So it's more common in HST, but it's certainly not routine across technology appraisals. So that's nice, but how common is the inclusion of carer burden globally? Well, we don't have such a clear picture for the other HTA bodies, as I personally haven't undertaken a review of all their published appraisals, and I'm not aware of anybody else who has. It's also quite difficult to draw comparisons, partly because of the roles of those different HTA bodies, and partly because of differences within the processes and the evidence that's available. For NICE, the company who manufacture the product would submit their evidence dossier, including their economic evaluation. That would then be reviewed by an independent assessment group before going to the committee for discussion, and it might then go back to both of those parties before coming back to the committee again. So there's numerous opportunities for people to consider whether carers and their burden should be included and how to do that. For other HTA bodies, that's not necessarily the process that's followed. In some cases, there's a company submission, and that's then reviewed and critiqued by the body, but there isn't another economic analysis undertaken. And in other cases, it's done by the HTA body themselves. The company doesn't submit evidence. So that means we don't have the same level of detail about all the different analyses, and the same level of documentation aren't publicly available. So in that sense, it's been quite difficult to make those comparisons. That said, we have tried to understand how carers were included globally. And we looked at 5 case studies where we knew that NICE had included carer burden. We used that as a starting point because we were aware of how unusual it is for NICE to include carers. So it's likely that that would be the same for the other HTA bodies, and we're trying to find case studies that did include carers. We found that some of the HTA bodies hadn't appraised all, or in some cases, any of those case studies, or perhaps they had, but they hadn't looked at economic evidence, or we couldn't access those documents. Of the information that we did have available, we saw that the TLB in Sweden and the Zorg Institute in the Netherlands did include carers in scenario analyses for all of the appraisals where we could get that information. ICER in the US and CADITH in Canada included carers in scenario analyses for some, but not all of those appraisals. If we think about the evidence that would typically be used for including patient health-related quality of life in economic evaluation, we'd expect that patient utility values would be collected as part of the clinical trial, and they'd be analysed and then feed into that economic evaluation. There might be a need to find additional utility values for patients from the literature for certain health states or things that might not be collected in that trial. But typically, we'd expect to see quite good evidence from the right disease for the right patient population informing that economic model. That's not the case for carers. It's relatively rare for there to be evidence from the clinical trial for the carers as well as the patients. And in fact, we saw the same handful of key studies used time and time again across different appraisals for different disease areas and in the 0.94. We're not entirely clear how this disutility of 0.14 was derived, but we assume it's a comparison with a carer utility of 0.86 to full health valued at 1. And this makes a comparison between carers and full health. But we think there's a couple of problems with this. One is that it ignores any potential comorbidities for the general population. So if we think about a population who have Alzheimer's, and the people who are caring for them are often their spouse or their partner, they would also be expected to be part of an elderly population who may have other comorbidities that would also impact their health-related quality of life. So we wouldn't expect them to have full health valued at 1 necessarily. And this also ignores selection into caregiving. It assumes that people who become informal carers are otherwise identical to people who don't become informal carers. But there might actually be other differences between these populations that haven't been accounted for. For example, we know that women are more likely to become informal carers, and women are more likely to have lower health than men. There's also a difference if we think about employment. People who are unemployed are more likely to become informal carers, but it may be that they are unemployed because of having worse health, and so then we'd see carers having worse health. And this sort of evidence doesn't necessarily answer that question of how is caregiving affecting health-related quality of life. If we look at another study that's been used a few times, this is a study from 2010, and it's analysis of medical expenditure panel survey data in the United States. This has EQ5D. And although the survey is collected across numerous years, all of these different waves of that survey were pooled and treated as cross-sectional data. They compared EQ5D of nearly 2,500 parents of children with an activity limitation to around 13,500 parents whose children did not have an activity limitation. They used a multivariable regression, including variables for parent demographic, income, insurance, etc., things that we'd expect might also influence the health-related quality of life of the parents. And they reported a disutility associated with having a child with an activity limitation of 0.07. So while this analysis does try to control for some of those differences in populations, it's still cross-sectional analysis, and it still doesn't quite answer the question of what's the causal effects of caring on somebody's health-related quality of life. So these are just a couple of the studies, and there's only a few more really. And these assume to be transferable across disease areas, across countries, despite some issues with those values that might be picked up if they were patient values, for example, not using reference case EQ5D, perhaps using HUE instead, or perhaps using value sets from different countries. There's a few different methods that have been used for including carer burden in the economic evaluations, and I'd like to illustrate these with this entirely hypothetical model. So we've got 3 health states: early stage, advanced stage, and death. Obviously, all of these health states would have a patient utility associated. Let's assume it's 0.6 for early, 0.4 for advanced, and 0 for death, as we would expect. An intervention that kept somebody in the early stage for longer would lead to more QALYs. By delaying disease progression, it means patients have that higher utility for longer. An intervention which improves survival would also lead to more QALYs for the patient because they'd be in those early or advanced stages for longer, accruing QALYs. Now let's assume that there's also a carer utility associated with each of these health states. Let's say it's 0.8 for early and 0.7 for advanced. Now, an intervention that delayed disease progression would lead to a QALY gain for carers. So they'd spend longer with that utility of 0.8 than they would with a utility of 0.7. Alternatively, we might use a carer disutility. In this case, we're making the comparison between those same carer utilities and full health of 1 to give a carer disutility of 0.2 for early stage and 0.3 for advanced stage. In this case, an intervention that delayed disease progression would reduce the QALY loss for carers. There'd be a QALY loss to both the intervention and the comparator, but this would be smaller for the intervention as the carer disutility is lower in that early stage. Now, mathematically, these would give the same results where we're only looking at the health states where the patient is alive. However, the impact of extending patient survival would differ depending on whether the utility or disutility approach is used and how that's included for death. And I know that's something that David Mott is going to talk about in a lot more detail later today, so I'll leave it to him to expand on that. And we note there are issues with these approaches, and some HTA guidance does note these issues too. An alternative that's been used in fewer appraisals is to assume that there's a carer health-related quality of life benefit to the patient being on treatment. And this is assumed to apply independent of the patient's health state. Clearly, in this case, the intervention would always lead to a gain in QALYs for carers because of that utility increment. In terms of the impact of including carer burden on the cost effectiveness results, this depends on the approach that's used as outlined in the previous slide. When we use the carer utility approach, including carers always increases the incremental QALY gains and decreases the ISA. And that's what we saw in the case studies that we saw across the globe. Using the carer disutility approach, the results could actually go either way. In some cases, the incremental QALY gains increased and the ISAs decreased. But in other cases, the incremental QALY gains decreased and so the ISAs increased. And this was particularly the case where treatments had a substantial impact on increasing patient survival. As well as seeing the direction of effect vary, we saw the magnitude of effect varies too. Perhaps obviously, this depends on the size of the carer health-related quality of life impact, what that utility is and how that changes. It varies depending on the number of carers. As we may expect, the impact of including carers increases if we're including more carers. And it varies depending on how the intervention itself affects patient health and survival. So it's not clear-cut how the results will change if we include carers. To conclude, carer burden is recognised as relevant for consideration, even if not necessarily in the base case, for most HTA bodies. That said, the actual inclusion of carer burden in HTA is still relatively uncommon. It's more common for orphan or rare diseases, and in some specific other conditions where there's a precedent for including carers. The evidence used to inform carer health-related quality of life is often assumed to be transferable across conditions and countries, and it's often poor quality data that stems from a few studies. The methods used to include carer burden vary, and they can lead to some quite surprising results. And the impact of including carer burden on cost effectiveness results varies substantially across appraisals. I've got a few references within my presentation that you can have a look at for some more information. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank you ever so much for listening to my presentation today, and I look forward to discussing this important topic with you later.
Thank you so much for that, Becky. That was very interesting. As a reminder to the audience, if you have any questions on Becky's presentation, please do enter them in the Q&A section on your screen, and we'll get to those as soon as we get to the Q&A. Now I'm very pleased to turn over to my colleague in the Measuring and Valuing Health Outcomes theme of OHE, David Mott, to discuss issues in the modeling of carer quality of life.
Thank you, Chris. So in this presentation, I'm going to build upon Becky's presentation and talk about two specific issues relating to the modeling of carer quality of life. So the first issue that I'm going to talk about relates to when the inclusion of carer quality of life reduces QALY gains, potentially leading to what we call the carer QALY trap. The second issue I'm going to go through relates to the consideration of bereavement in economic models. So before I get started talking about the Carey-Qualley trap, I need to acknowledge several individuals. So this presentation is based in part on a piece of work that OHE conducted, which was commissioned and funded by Roche Products Limited. And as part of this project, we conducted an expert roundtable, and we've written a manuscript on one particular topic that was discussed, which is the Carey-Qualley trap that I'm going to go through today. The co-authors on that manuscript are listed on the left-hand side of the slide, but I also want to acknowledge Chris Schedule, in particular for his contributions to this piece of work. I also want to acknowledge the roundtable participants that are not co-authors, and they're listed on the right-hand side of the screen. So finally, just a disclaimer, the expert roundtable participants were not involved in the preparation of this presentation, so the opinions expressed are those of my own. All right, so as you heard in Becky's presentation, one way to model carer quality of life is to use disutilities. And in this context, what we mean by a disutility is the difference between the carer's quality of life and their potential quality of life if they had no caring responsibilities, where the latter is estimated based on population norms. So for example, imagine that on average, individuals in the general population have a quality of life of 75 on a 0 to 100 scale, where 0 is the worst health imaginable and 100 is the best health imaginable. Now imagine that carers of the same as age and sex, on average, have a quality of life of 55. The difference between those two figures, 20, is what we call the disutility. And that's the average impact of caring on quality of life of carers. And notably, it's worth highlighting here that it's typically assumed that carers will return to their age-sex baseline when their caring responsibilities are removed. And I'm going to come back to that later in the presentation. So I'm now going to provide some simple examples that show how the inclusion of carer quality of life can have differing impacts on the output of economic models, which will set up the discussion of the Carey-Qualley trap. So in this particular example, a hypothetical treatment improves patient quality of life, but doesn't extend their lives. So in the diagrams that I'm about to show you, the series of diagrams, we have patient quality of life on the y-axis of the leftmost diagram, and time or survival on the x-axis. And so you can see on the left-hand side, we have the patient that after treatment, their quality of life increases. So the green boxes stack higher, but they don't gain any survival beyond what they previously were going to experience, which is represented here by the light blue area. So because patients' quality of life improves, that has a knock-on effect and improves carer quality of life. So it reduces the burden on carers and therefore reduces the disutility. So on the right, on the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see how carer quality of life is improving as a result of the treatment, as indicated by the green boxes. So in this particular example, both patient and carer quality of life improves, and they the treatment generates additional QALYs as a result for both patients and carers. And we've put some example numbers to this, which are on the bottom of the slide, which I appreciate are probably quite hard to read. They're just illustrative. So in this example, patients get 2.7 QALYs as a result of this new treatment, and carers gain 1.9 QALYs as a result of this treatment. So the net QALYs gained from this treatment would be a total of 4.6. Now, in this example, a new treatment extends the life of the patient, but doesn't improve their quality of life at all. So you can see from the green boxes that survival is increased, but quality of life remains the same throughout that period of time. So because patient quality of life is not improved carer quality of life is not improved either. So the disutility remains the same throughout that period of time. And this is essentially saying that the burden on the carer is extended as a result of this treatment that only increases the survival of the patient and not their quality of life. So now, whilst patients gain some QALYs through the life extension, in this case, in this example, 3.6 QALYs, carers are now actually losing some QALYs because the negative impact on their quality of life continues for longer than it would have previously, and therefore they lose, in this example, a total of 2.4 QALYs. So the inclusion of carer quality of life here, or the consideration of carer quality of life, reduces the overall QALY gains offered by this particular treatment. Nonetheless, overall, the treatment is still going to offer some net QALY gains. So the patient's QALY gain is larger than the carer's QALY loss. Now, in this final example, it's somewhat similar to the last, but patients survive because patient survival improves and quality of life doesn't. But now, patient quality of life declines over time, as you can see from the green boxes, decreasing towards the end of the left-hand side diagram. Now, because patient quality of life and carer quality of life are linked, as patient quality of life gets worse, so does carer quality of life. So now, carers experience worse utility over time in this example. So with the numbers that we've put into this example, carers now lose 3.1 QALYs, whereas patients are gaining 2.9 from that increase in survival. So as a result, with this treatment, although it is a life-extending treatment for the patient, overall it's producing negative net QALYs. So minus 0.2 net QALYs. So this isn't an incremental analysis, there's no comparator here, but regardless of that, this treatment would not be cost-effective at any price because overall it produces negative QALYs once you consider both carers and patients. And it's also worth highlighting here that in our example, nobody is experiencing a health state that is worse than death, but nonetheless, this treatment is producing negative QALYs. So with those examples, what I've shown is that in some cases, consideration of carer quality of life can make an intervention less attractive in terms of the net QALY gains, potentially even implying that a life-extending treatment for patients has negative societal value. And again, as I said, despite nobody experiencing a health state that is worse than dead. So such a case is going to be relatively rare. It's far more likely to occur, but it is far more likely to occur when patient quality of life is poor at baseline, because that means that carer disutilities would be very high. And it's also more likely to occur when the treatment is primarily, but not necessarily exclusively, life-extending. Other factors that may make this more likely are things like patient quality of life declining over time. As patient quality of life declines, so does carer quality of life. And bereavement not being considered at all can also have an impact here, as that may exacerbate the impact on carers. And I'll come back to that later in the presentation. Okay, so denying life-extending treatment, at least in part due to the impact that the treatment might have on carer quality of life, may well be consistent with the principles of QALY maximization. But it might not necessarily be consistent with the preferences of patients, carers, or even society more broadly. And if because of that, decision makers decide to address that disconnect between QALY maximization and stakeholder preferences by disregarding the impact that the treatment has on carer quality of life, then it wouldn't then be possible to simultaneously value patient life extensions as well as improvements in carer quality of life. And that's what we refer to as the carer QALY trap. This may sound a little bit familiar because the carer QALY trap is analogous to the classic QALY trap. which was introduced by Ubel and colleagues over 20 years ago. So under the classic quality trap, extending the life of a person with a chronic illness is less valuable in quality terms than extending the life of a person in full health, if all else is equal. But if society decide, or decision makers decide to disregard quality of life in valuing a life extension, and therefore assign equal value to all lives to deal with this, it implies that curing the chronic illness itself doesn't have any value. And so you're stuck in this trap. So similarly with the care quality trap, what is happening here is that essentially extending the life of a person with an informal carer is less valuable in quality terms than extending the life of a person without a carer, if all else is equal. And again, if society or decision makers choose to disregard the quality of life of carers when valuing a life extension, it implies that reducing the burden on the carer has no value. And again, you're trapped. And that's why these two ideas are similar. So there are a few different possible options for decision makers when the inclusion of carer quality of life decreases quality gains. One option, most sort of simplest option, would be to ignore carer burden in those cases. And there may be some justification for that. So many carers might say actually they would prioritize the survival of the person for whom they're caring and disregard their own quality of life in this sort of situation. But ultimately, this leads you to the carer quality trap, where if you ignore carer quality of life, you essentially are not valuing or would not enable value to be assigned to improvements in carer quality of life. So another option might be to just accept the result. There's nothing technically incorrect with this. The burden is extended, fewer qualities are accrued, and based on the principles of quality maximization, the results make sense. Because the problem is, as I've said, is that this may be at odds with the preferences of the patients themselves or the carers themselves, or even just the preferences of society more generally. Another option could be to consider different metrics. So the carer quality trap is arising when we attempt to combine length and quality of life into a single metric multiplicatively. We could use a different metric, something such as equal value life years gained or health years in total, because those disaggregate the survival gains and the quality of life improvements, and extending that to this situation may be useful. To separate out these different effects. But shifting away from the quality would be difficult on many levels, and it may not be justifiable given how rare this situation is likely to be in practice, not least because the new metrics would require new cost-effectiveness thresholds. So that is a big undertaking. Furthermore, if you disaggregate quality of life and survival gains, that is somewhat at odds with HTA agencies' sort of careful indifference towards the source of quality gains. So another option could be to value something else. So carers don't undertake caring for their health, but out of a sense of responsibility and love towards the person for whom they're caring. In that view, it's not necessarily appropriate to measure the effects of caring solely in terms of health-related quality of life, as we currently do. And actually, maybe there's a case here for considering some alternative measure of a different construct, such as well-being, which would generally be seen as a broader construct. The problem is that considering a broader construct such as well-being for carers and not for patients would create some inconsistency, which is likely to be a problem for HTA agencies. So if instead you say, okay, let's consider well-being for everyone, that's maybe a reasonable thing to do, but it is a very significant change from the status quo, and therefore is probably quite unlikely in practice. So finally, another option for decision makers is to simply discuss the problem. So HTA is a deliberative process. It's informed, of course, by a quantitative model, but it's not deterministic. decision makers can choose how much or how little weight to give to the quantitative results. And you might be able to avoid problems here by discussing situations where society might prefer to depart from strict quality maximization as part of the HTA process. Of course, the problem with deliberation is it's not always transparent or consistent, so it can be criticized. But nonetheless, that is an option. So overall, there are a few different things that could be done to deal with this situation, but none of them are without their own problems. So the expert roundtable that we conducted discussed the issue of the Kerr-Qualley trap and basically concluded that this is a normative issue rather than a technical one. So in some cases, the implications of quality maximization may be uncomfortable, and that's ultimately what this issue boils down to. But overall, it was agreed that a technical fix is not likely to be necessary here, and that the deliberative processes that HTA agencies have should enable ample consideration of this issue. And finally, it was felt that in general submissions, HTA submissions should present as much contextual information as possible, acknowledging that there are burdens on carers, but also highlighting the normative value of life extensions for patients in positive utility health states. Okay, so that's the Kerr-Qualley trap. My final few slides relate to the issue of bereavement. So this is one of the examples from earlier. So on the left-hand side, you have the patient situation. Their quality of life is improved as a result of the treatment, but declines over time. Carer quality of life is negatively affected by the patient's quality of life. It improves when the patient's quality of life improves, but subsequently declines later, and it's at its worst point just before the patient dies. So that's at the very end of the right-hand side of the second diagram. So at the point of the death of the patient, it's essentially assumed that carer quality of life returns to that of an average member of the general population. And so in other words, the death of the patient is seen, or at least modeled, as a utility improving event for the carer. Now that is an unusual assumption, to say the least, as carers are typically looking after family members, and the death of a family member is realistically not going to improve your quality of life. So this begs the question, should you consider bereavement in economic models? So should you extend perhaps some disutility to reflect this? And it's actually a very contentious topic with different arguments for and against. So I'll run through some of the key arguments. One of the main arguments for including some kind of bereavement effect or disutility is that it's going to most likely improve the face validity of economic models. So health-related quality of life is likely to be affected by bereavement, and including some kind of effect would therefore improve the face validity of the model. It's arguably not a substantial deviation from the status quo. It could still be a consideration of quality of life and just an extra input into the model considered for a longer period of time. Another potential benefit to doing this is that it may offset to some extent quality losses that are caused by the inclusion of carer quality of life, because a life-extending treatment will push the bereavement further into the future, and therefore it may minimize the negative impact of including carer quality of life in those sort of rare cases, and potentially help to avoid the carer quality trap in doing so. Although ultimately the impact is generally going to be quite small of including bereavement effect. Those are some of the arguments for. There are also several arguments against including bereavement effects. The first and a very important point is that there is very little data on bereavement effects out there at the moment. And there's also likely to be very significant heterogeneity depending on the context of the disease area and so on. Traditional health-related quality of life instruments that we typically use to measure utilities may not necessarily be ideal for capturing the impact of bereavement in the longer term. So that's another challenge here. And there's also, and this is probably the biggest challenge, is that there's also an ethical dilemma. So if you consider bereavement in some models, for example, in models where you consider care or quality of life, there is an argument that you should then include bereavement effects in all models. And that then becomes a very big change to the status quo. So overall, there's a lot to consider when it comes to bereavement effects. And in fact, during NICE's recent methods review, this issue was considered. And the conclusion was that bereavement effects should not be included, at least for now. But further research on this is likely to be helpful. All right, so that brings me to the end of my presentation. As you can see, there are some issues when it comes to capturing care or quality of life in economic models. And further research will help to deal with those issues in the future. Thank you for your time.
Okay. A few questions have come in. The top rated question is, will attendees have access to the slides afterwards? And the answer is yes. All registrants will receive an email with a link to an archived version of today's webinar. After that one, the top rated question is about the severity modifier and how that might play a role in considering care quality of life and the value of care quality of life in HTA. So to read the question specifically, what might be the impact of the NICE severity modifier on care qualities? Could the adjustment that's made as part of that severity adjustment carry over to care quality of life, I guess, starting from the presumption that more severe conditions impose a greater burden on carers? I will throw that one up there for either one of you to be brave enough to address.
Sure, thanks for the question. I'll clarify that I'm speaking from my own opinion and not as a NICE committee member here. For those of you who aren't aware, NICE's 2022 manual now includes this decision modifier for severity. So the committee will consider the severity of the condition defined as the future health loss by people living with the condition with standard care in the NHS. And that can be then reflected using additional weights that are applied to the QALY gain for that intervention. And that QALY shortfall is currently just estimated for the patient, so carers are specified to be excluded from that. So could we include carers in that? Mathematically, we could also put their QALYs in and compare the QALYs that they would accrue to the general population who aren't caring for someone. But there'd then be a couple of issues. The first one would be, are you looking over the patient's lifetime or over the carer's lifetime? And if you're looking over the carer's lifetime, you've then got all those same issues related to bereavement that David's just been talking about. So that's a big issue and something to consider. And the way that the decision modifier for severity works is it's designed to reflect an equity argument that there should be more weight given to people with more severe diseases. Whereas the rationale for including carers in the health outcomes is to maximise health outcomes for the whole population. So it's two slightly different approaches to combine in that way. And as yet, I don't think we have evidence for what those sorts of weights should be for carer quality shortfall in the same way that we do for patient quality shortfall. So it's difficult to see at present how we would use it without overcoming those issues of bereavement and the weights from an equity perspective.
David, did you want to weigh in on that at all?
No, they're really great points from Becky there. Completely agree with everything she said. It is feasible to do it for sure, but there's no, a lot of work would need to be done to understand what the weight should be in that situation. So, yeah, agreed.
David, this second question, perhaps I'll direct it towards you, but Becky, obviously feel free to jump in at any point. So the question is, do specific tools for measuring care burden exist? So this is perhaps in part in response to your suggestion that maybe we just need a different metric Are you familiar with specific tools for measuring carer burden? And to what extent are you aware that clinical trials may or may not typically include them?
Okay, sure. So there are definitely specific measures for measuring the impact on carers. So, for example, there's a measure called the carer qual measure. It's a short questionnaire that we filled out by carers and focuses on specific issues that are likely to impact them and their quality of life. And there are value sets for that instrument to enable you to estimate some qualities. The challenge with what you might call carer-specific measures is that you don't have that comparability with the measures that you would use to measure patient quality of life. And so you see guidance suggesting that the same sort of measures that you use for patients should be used for carers as well on that basis. So something like EQ5D. There is a new measure, the EQHWB, so the EQ health and well-being measure, which has been developed with carers in mind. So that is a generic measure that potentially could be used for both patients and carers and might be a bit more appropriate for use in carers, and is meant to cover sort of slightly broader constructs and not just health-related quality of life, but some sort of concept of well-being as well. And so that may be an improvement over something like EQ5D, but there's still a lot of research that needs to be done with that measure. Oh,
Becky, sorry, Becky, in your research, did you see that these sorts of measures are being used, collected routinely as part of clinical trials?
So I haven't looked a great deal at clinical trials. I've focused more on the outcomes that have been presented to HTA bodies, and there we've typically seen either EQ5D or similar measures or things that have been assumed to be equivalent. So I think David is definitely the right person to answer this question. Thank you ever so much, David.
I'm going to put both of you on the spot. There's an interesting question here, but I'm be very curious to see how you address it. Could patient and carer efficiency essentially be considered separately? What do you think of the idea of producing two ICERs? This maybe, David, this goes to the idea of having separate but not comparable measures in an assessment. Do you see any role for multiple ICERs? Is it possible to consider the cost effectiveness to a patient and to a carer in separate terms?
I mean, kind of similar to the point around the severity modifier, I guess, yeah, mathematically, and you could put something together like that. I don't know if it really would be that useful in practice if you're just creating more complication with that, and I don't know if it would necessarily be an improvement over trying to combine everything into one model.
It does seem that the decision rule would get pretty blurry if it's effective in one context but not cost effective in the other. Is right. What do you do with that information? Becky, your research objectively showed that different HTA bodies approach the problem of considering carer quality of life in different ways. On the basis of your research, or even perhaps on a more sort of personal position, do you have a position on whether HTA should be routinely considering carer quality of life?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to look actually in more detail than I've presented here about when HTA bodies include it and what their rationale is. And there's often it's stated to be down to perspectives, which are outcomes like societal or healthcare system perspectives. But I think the strongest argument for including carers is that you're aiming to maximise the health for a population. So if carers are part of that population, their health should be included. Whereas the arguments against including carers would be either that the decision rules, so things like ICER thresholds, don't include displaced care, displaced health-related quality of life for carers. So in that case, it's not fair to then include it for some that you're assessing and not those that you're displacing. And then I guess the other arguments are that it's hard. It's got all these challenges that we've talked about and that David's been covering. For me personally, I can't see that you shouldn't include it as a standpoint. I think there's work that needs to be done to do it better and to consider it better, and displaced health-related quality of life gains for carers. But I can't see that there's a strong enough argument not to include carers and their health outcomes.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions that have come in, and I'm going to use my discretion to combine them a bit. Becky, you discussed a lot the impact of carer quality of life in assessments. Did you look much at the financial side of those burdens?
No, so I was looking at carer health outcomes rather than informal care costs. I guess if you're looking at effects, you should look at costs too, and some arguments. So, and I guess if they were formal care, if that care was provided by a nurse or a kind of care assistant, there would be a cost to that, and that would be a cost to the healthcare system. But the sorts of costs that we're looking at typically aren't specified to be included. So, for example, NICE's methods guide talks about health outcomes for carers, but it doesn't make the same sorts of recommendations about including costs and healthcare costs for informal carers. And perhaps there's parallels with the fact that we don't typically include future unrelated costs. I'm not sure whether there's kind of parallels there.
There is speaking of parallels, there is a parallel sort of question here. Should we account for productivity should we have a productivity adjusted life year lost, is what the person is asking. So in the previous session, Portia spoke about caring for her child and having to leave her job as a primary school teacher. And the questioner is saying, well, there's a relative lack of teachers in the UK. Should that sort of productivity loss be counted in simply the financial sense? But equally, should we say that there is an even greater loss to society because we've taken someone perhaps at the prime of their earning out of the labor force? First of all, do you think we need that level of refinement in how we consider financial costs? And even if we are we in a position to come up with those sorts of productivity losses or productivity adjustments?
I think it would be strange to include it for carers and not for patients. I very much appreciate that the burden of informal caregiving could be so great that somebody would be having to give up or at least substantially reduce their working. But we would see the same for many patients with many diseases, and indeed for many patients with diseases where they don't have informal caregivers in that regard. So should we include productivity and related outcomes in economic evaluation? Well, depending on the perspective, yes. Should we do it for carers but not for patients? I'd be much more inclined to say no. I couldn't see an argument for doing that.
And then perhaps final question on this sort of a topic. Again, in your review, is there a standard of how many carers the HTA bodies assumed were affected by the care? Is it simply one patient, one carer, or did you find that there was a variation in that?
So one is the most common. Most commonly it's one carer, but it can be more than that. I think particularly in the case where you're looking at diseases that affect children, considering that most children have more than one parent, certainly at times there is more than one carer.
Yeah, it might be worth adding to that. So I know in practice there's been some variation, and I think during the NICE methods review, they put together the task and finish group that was working on health-related quality of life, put together some what they call minimum evidence standards around the kind of data and the way in which care quality of life is considered. And I think so these aren't this isn't methods guidance, but it was a suggestion that I believe it said that there should primarily think about one carer in appraisals. So I suppose that issue there's still it's a bit of an ongoing debate around that one.
Thank you. David, one more for you. So this is referring to the bereavement effect that you brought up in your presentation. So the questioner asks, all patients ultimately die, so wouldn't bereavement be relevant for all models? Survival gains of treatment only delay bereavement, therefore the effect on the ICER would essentially be discounting. Is that correct?
So I can see the argument for, including bereavement irrespective of whether people have a carer. Equally, it is such a difficult thing to get reliable data on that I think there's also a very good case to leave it regardless of whether people have a carer or not. That there's very few data sources on it. So there have been some studies using like databases trying to estimate roughly on average what's the impact of bereavement. Those are obviously there's obviously going to be a lot of heterogeneity in reality, and that's not necessarily going to be reflected in one average estimate. And then if you try to imagine coming up with some sort of utility using some of the methods we use to obtain or to value health states, if you start going down that line of thinking about asking people questions about bereavement, you end up with a task you probably don't want to actually conduct with people from the general population, asking them about imagining situations where they have had a bereavement. So I think there are probably on average more problems with considering bereavement than would justify going down that road, but there's certainly room for a lot of research there.
Okay. Perhaps I'm looking at the time, and just very quickly as a final question, I noticed you spoke about deliberative solutions, deliberation as a possible escape from the carer quality trap. And you mentioned that there are trade-offs, obviously, between the transparency of a purely quantitative approach versus the more opaqueness and less transparency of a deliberative approach. How would you see balancing those two things? Which side of that balance, I guess, would you think is the most appropriate in these sorts of contexts?
Yeah, I think it's a tricky question. So deliberation, it's a useful thing to fall back on, and it's obviously there to be used in the context of HTA. The problem obviously is that it's not necessarily very transparent, and there might not be consistent consideration between appraisals. In this particular case, it's hard to think of what the best alternative would be to avoid that sort of situation. Certainly, as Becky presented about the data quality, and that's one area where there could be a lot more improvement. And actually, with better data, you might not find yourself in that situation where the impact on carers is so negative.
Thank you. So I see that we are 29 minutes after the hour. So I want to thank our speakers, David and Becky, for a very interesting presentation. And I hope everyone can join us on Wednesday for the third and the final session in this series, where we will be hearing from a carer, an HTA representative, a pharmaceutical representative and an academic representative, who will all discuss what they see as next steps in meeting some of these challenges. Thank you very much.